They do view us as a threat. Having said that, I don't agree with others who think that if we would only be nice to them, they would be nice to us. That's not true. I'm sure the North Koreans have other objectives, and I can't predict, but if tomorrow, just like in the case of regime collapse, U.S. forces disappeared off the Korean Peninsula, what would be the result? I don't know. You know, the North Koreans, they may decide to go south. I just don't know. So I'm not saying that they, have all these great intentions, and if only we were nice, they would be nice back. They probably don't have great intentions, and I think most of us understand that. Maybe not Doug Bandow. Please don't put me with Doug Bandow, because I think that certainly from our perspective, if we engage in the kinds of policy I'm talking about, the number one priority is that we maintain our alliance relationships. And someone will say, well, gee, the North Koreans, if you get into this peace treaty negotiation with them, the first thing they're going to demand is that all troops leave the peninsula. U.S. troops leave the peninsula because that's part of the nuclear threat. The North Koreans understand that if they make that demand, we walk out. I've had this discussion with them. They understand that. And so it's a game ender. The negotiation is over. So the issue is whether it's possible to have this kind of discussion in a way that continues to maintain our alliance relationships as we move forward. Totally agree. We have to maintain those.
It seems to me, Joel, you just made Peter's point. He said that North Korea sees us as a threat because we will defend South Korea against their aggression. And then you said, no, they have a reason for seeing us as a threat. Look at the Korean War. That's what happened. They invaded South Korea, we came to South Korea's defense. So the problem with North Korea is they are an aggressive nation. It's in the nature of their regime, and there's nothing we can do to assuage their concerns. To a lesser extent, we say this about China as well, and Russia.
Well, that's I can see your point of view on that, but essentially what you're saying is we might as well just forget about dealing with this issue. Because the other things we're talking about, like sanctions and military measures, aren't going to solve it. They're not going to do it. I can predict that. I predicted that 8 years ago when the Obama administration took a similar approach with sanctions and whatever else it was doing. It's not going to solve the problem.
If you think we should defend South Korea, and you're in favor of that, so your life is different.
Thanks.
Terry?
Let me throw out a couple of other ideas about North Korean motives and get Joel's reaction. And then I want to ask Joel a specific question about his proposal for going into a negotiation of a peace agreement or peace treaty with North Korea. There have been periods when I do believe the North Koreans were worried about a possible U.S. military move against them. I think during the 1993-94 period that Joel has referenced, when there was talk of bombing Yongbyon, I think there may well have been some real worry in Pyongyang. There certainly were signs of this kind of worry in Pyongyang too after the United States invaded Iraq. And there was talk that North Korea is next. You may remember Kim Jong-il dropped out of sight for several months, right after the invasion of Iraq. So I think there have been periods, but I don't think this is constant when the North Koreans constantly fear a U.S. military preemptive strike or attack against them. What I think they fear more and view guarantee against is the fear of South Korea, the fear of political and economic influence getting into their state and their society from South Korea. And the nuclear program serves to solidify their concept of the closed state. A state which can maintain and even strengthen these barriers against this kind of influence from South Korea and perhaps from the broader outside as well. The nuclear program solidifies the military state. What Kim Jong-il described as the military first policy of North Korea. At a time when North Korea's conventional military capabilities were in a steep decline in the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the nuclear program buttressed the military's role in North Korea, and thus helped to solidify that kind of closed military state that North Korea is today. Part of the fear of South Korea, I think on North Korea's part, is also how they respond to it, is their attitude that responding to it necessitates continually threatening, intimidating, and demeaning and diminishing South Korea. And their nuclear capabilities, in their view, give them a greater capacity to do that. And warheads on the no-dongs is the latest example of that. And it's no accident that this is their first real accomplishment in terms of a nuclear delivery system that can threaten South Korea with a massive nuclear attack. And then finally, as Ms. Heinrichs alluded to, in January, the Treasury Department imposed sanctions against a high-ranking Iranian military official. And the State Department's justification for the sanctions against this guy included that he facilitated the dispatch in 2012 of Iranian nuclear experts to North Korea to assist North Korea in its program to develop long-range missiles. Now, the Treasury Department finally has admitted what the Obama administration has not wanted to talk about, as Ms. Heinrichs pointed out, this deep North Korean-Iranian collaboration, both in developing missiles and in developing nuclear warheads. And when the Iranians do send their technicians, when they do send their observers to the nuclear test, and we know they have been at, I think, every one of their tests so far, they pay handsomely, and there are reports about them paying hundreds of millions of dollars to the North Koreans. So the nuclear program is a financial bonanza for the Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un regime. And that's another motive behind this program. Now, there's a lot that Joel talked about that I agree with, his myths. The only thing I would add on myth number 5, diplomacy cannot work with North Korea, and here I'm going to go after the State Department, that our negotiators often blunder and make strategic and tactical errors in negotiations. 2 handshake verbal agreements with North Koreans in October 2008 and February 2012. Do you think they're going to keep a handshake verbal agreement? No, these two guys, Chris Hill and the other guy, I can't remember his name, they should get naivety awards, frankly. Bush administration made numerous concessions to the North Koreans, partly because of Chris Hill's advice, partly because of Condoleezza Rice. And it all turned against them in the end, coming out of that October 2012 blunder handshake verbal agreement, which the North denied ever having made with Chris Hill. That was the humorous thing, frankly, cynical, humorous thing about it. But the 5 points are valid. The 5 points are very valid. I also think his points about making North Korea a greater priority, being willing to take some domestic political risk, which I think the Obama administration clearly is not wanted to do, and rethinking the goal of denuclearization, I think, are quite valid. So, my question about the peace agreement proposal that Joel is putting forward. Number one, are you advocating that we agree to a bilateral peace negotiation with North Korea? Secondly, how would we satisfy what would be a major dissatisfaction about that with South Korea, if in fact that's what you're proposing? And could you go into a little bit more detail about how we would negotiate on the issue of U.S. troops in a peace treaty negotiation with the North?
Thank you, Larry.
I was going to say, and do that in 2 minutes or less. These are all valid questions, and I'm going to amend, I'll get to them in a second, I'm going to amend my earlier remarks to you. I totally agree with Larry on the weekday deal. I mean, you know, that's another myth. We have this myth here that, the North Koreans, they walked away from that deal and they screwed things up. Well, in fact, a handshake deal isn't worth anything. And that's all we really had. I mean, if you were, most of you haven't worked in the State Department for 15 or 20 years, but you'd see that if an agreement is reached and each capital issues a different communique on the agreement, which doesn't even have the same language, and there's no single piece of paper that everyone signed off on, there's something wrong. And that's exactly what happened with that deal. It was negotiated very badly. You're absolutely right. On the other questions you asked, Larry, in terms of whether whatever this negotiation is for a peace declaration, a peace regime, it shouldn't be bilateral. It can't be the United States, just the United States and North Korea. It has to have, certainly has to have South Korea, and China may have to participate in parts of it as well. This is a very valid question you ask about major dissatisfaction in South Korea. I'm not sure how you would deal with that if it happened. And I'm certain it would happen, actually. Even though I think today in South Korea, you're hearing many more voices talking about dissatisfaction with the current situation. And it's on all sides, conservative and the more moderate and the more liberal. They're all unhappy with how things are going now. You know, whether you could harness that and say, okay, here's what we have to do, it's almost certain that there'll still be dissatisfaction. And indeed, there's always dissatisfaction. There'll always be dissatisfaction with whatever approach we take, the United States takes. So I think I can't answer, I'm not answering your question directly, but I think it's an important issue. How do you deal with your ally if you enter into this discussion?
South Korea's participation is
That's very important. They can't be sitting outside the door waiting for you to come out and tell them what's going on. That's absolutely a non-starter. I'm sorry, I forgot your last question.
Well, any further thoughts you have about how exactly we would approach negotiating about U.S. troops?
Oh, U.S. troops. Yeah, once again, that's a good question. If you were engaged in a phased process leading to a peace regime that might also lead to denuclearization, if we want to look at the pot of gold over the rainbow, how would you do it in a phased process? That's important. And I don't have the answer for that either. The only answer I have is that the alliance, in one form or another, has to continue. U.S. troops have to stay on the peninsula until and including at the end. That sounds strange. Why would the North Koreans agree to that? Well, if you played this out, what you're essentially trying to do, and it's not easy, I'm not saying it's going to be simple, you're engineering a different political environment on the peninsula, where you're moving away from tension to maybe less tense, to even something like, a sunshine-like North-South relationship. In that context, I don't think the North Koreans would have problems with the U.S. troops remaining on the peninsula. That may sound naive, but in fact, in the past, depending on political relationships, they said that. They said that officially. So I wish I could think of the phasing and what you would do with ground forces and air forces, and I haven't thought about that. So I think it's a valid question.
Thanks, Joe. Peter, do you have any last